What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? She asked the question to the wind, and the barn answered with the steady clack of frozen hooves against concrete. Frost patterned the bale wrappers, like lace. Her breath came out in white coins that vanished before she could count them. The stable smelled of old hay and something softer. A hint of sweat, of leather saddles kept too long without polishing, and the faint, impossible sweetness of a horse's breath. It was the kind of cold that makes silence a living thing. It moved through the rafters and under her boots, through the tiny scab of warmth in her chest where grief sat like a coin in a pocket. She didn't say the name anymore. Names became hard to carry after the funeral. They turned to pages that folded themselves shut. She walked the aisle by habit at first. The sun had not yet woken the sky. The light stayed gray like a held breath. Her hands found the stall door the way hands find shore in a dream. Automatically, as if muscle memory remembered more than she did. She touched the wood, felt the splintered stories of 1,000 mornings. The stall smelled different from the others, as if it had been waiting. Across the way the gelding stood with his head near the bars, fog rising from his nostrils into the emptiness. He had the kind of size you notice before you register what he looks like, a quiet gravitational bulk that seems to steady the room. He wasn't prancing or anxious. He held himself in long, patient lines, back like a low horizon, legs planted, neck curving the way a river curves around a stone. His coat had that winter dullness that hides color until light pins it down. When it did, he was a dark thing that swallowed the gray. She let the silence swell between them like something living. She did not rush. There was a wariness in her that felt worked into her bones, the kind left over from standing at gravesides. The gelding's ears flicked, one to the left, one to the right, and the flick was more question than reflex. He did not try to nuzzle. He did not stamp. He only watched, as if waiting to decide whether she would belong to his world. She had imagined 1,000 ways this might happen. A dramatic rescue. A wild, instant attachment. A clear, cinematic acceptance. None of that is how it begins with real grief. It begins with small, quiet negotiations. She cleared her throat, and the sound was tiny among the beams. The horse lifted his head a few inches, the way a person might look up from reading when someone they know steps into the room. His eyes were not shiny black marbles. They had a gentle cloud to them, a thickness that comes from years of sun and slow thinking. When he blinked, the lids were long and soft. She moved closer by degrees. Her boots made the same dull thud on the floorboards. She kept her hands in her pockets. She lowered herself to the level she thought would not be frightening. Not too close, not too far. The gelding watched the way you watch weather changing, with a steady, patient curiosity. He breathed in, and the sound filled the gap of winter in a way that startled her. It was warm and ordinary and absolutely real. The warm breath ghosted across her sleeve. She could feel tiny pricks of moisture where his whiskers rubbed. She remembered the first thing the dead had taught her about living. That you could hold something only if you first allowed it to be itself. That meant letting the gelding be heavy, with his own history. The horse had come to them from the pond. That detail was a newspaper line on someone else's page, not a room she'd sit in. He had come on a night when men with ropes and kindness lifted him from the ice. But the man who loved him had not come back. That was the quiet that nested in the stall. She exhaled. It sounded like letting go of rope. The gelding dropped his head a hair, and where his muzzle met the wood there was a small hush, a settling that felt like permission. He pressed a soft nose against the plank that separated them, then slid it along the grain as if reading lines of a book she'd never been allowed to open. She reached out because reaching did not require a promise. Her hand was small against the animal's face, and the skin over his cheek was rough in a way that made her palms obey. He did not flinch. He accepted that touch with the slow, economical tolerance of something that has known humans long enough to judge them by the parts that matter. He had a scar along the mandible, thin and pale, a map of some old scrape. She traced it with the pad of her thumb and felt, absurdly, like she was tracing the edge of a memory that wasn't hers to own. The gelding tilted his head into her hand the way someone leans into a wind that finally shifts direction. It was not an eager lean. It was a measured, deliberate surrender. She let herself breathe around the small fact that he trusted her to touch that scar. Trust with horses is not a feeling you can demand or even expect. It is measured in inches and seconds and the sameness of your hands. He tasted of hay and salt and a kind of tired patience. She found herself whispering something. Not a name, not an apology. Just a small, useless truth. It's okay. He stood, exactly where he was, and made a little sound in his throat. Half sigh, half chuff. It was a sound that meant yes and maybe, and I am listening. The sound lodged in her like a small stone in a shoe, uncomfortable and somehow grounding. The barn creaked. Somewhere a bucket moved. There was a life to this place that was stubbornly indifferent to any single sorrow. That made room for it. It made room for her and the gelding in the way a tide will leave a little pool behind, full of light and yet separate from the sea. She lingered until the sun pulled a thin thread of gold across the far wall. Daylight changed everything slightly, as if revealing the reality instead of the idea of reality. The horse's eyes flicked to the doorway and then back to her, as if checking whether she had left room in herself for him. Before she could say anything more, the memory of the pond came back to her, brief, sharp, like a cut. Men knee-deep in ice water, ropes biting into gloves, shouts muffled by wind. The thought was a sting that opened the old wound. She felt the old panic lift like a veil and then settle again into the deeper, slower grief. She supposed she should leave. Leave while she could keep it together. Leave while she could control the edges of her feeling. She had been trained by loss to leave early, before the last light, before something else could fall apart. She rose on legs that suddenly felt heavier than the gelding's whole mass, and for an instant she misunderstood herself. She expected him to watch her go and return to his corners. She expected that was the end of it. But when she moved toward the door, the gelding slid his weight forward by the width of his front hoof, and followed the motion with a small, almost invisible step, not a bold following. A move so minimal it might have been his body correcting itself. She did not look back. She did not need to. There was a thread now, tiny and unremarkable, running between them. It tugged in ways she couldn't name. She paused, just inside the doorway, and felt, for the first time since the funeral, a slightly lessened pressure in her chest. She stepped into the cold, and the gelding's breath clouded the air behind her. He watched her for a long, private second, and then he did something she never expected. He followed. She didn't know why he followed. She didn't know why she allowed him. But as the barn door side closed behind them, a new kind of silence settled, one threaded with the possibility that someone else might keep walking with her. And that uncertainty, the small, bright ache of it, made the rest of the morning feel like the first page of a book she had almost forgotten she wanted to read. He startled at the smallest things now. An uneven patch of snow. A forgotten scarf, as if the world had become a room full of doors he might not recognize. The gelding froze at a puddle, and after a long moment stepped through it like someone deciding the damp was no longer betrayal. Sometimes he found a corner and stood, with his nose tucked into his chest, eyes closed, breathing the way someone keeps watch over an old sorrow. She learned him by the edges. He reacted to certain words with the tilt of his head. The mention of river tightened his jaw and made her stomach drop. He would nudge at a jacket someone had worn the night he came from the ice, searching as if trying to read missing pages. Once she found him guarding a crumpled blanket in the pasture, standing through rain as if holding the shape of something only he could see. The barn became a map of small revelations. Places he avoided, the willow, the trickle where ice had been thin, were breadcrumbs. Sounds made him start, distant children's laughter, an old engine. She followed those signs the way a person follows a broken trail, not realizing she was following herself toward truth. Nights shortened. She dreamed of water that would not hold, hands that could not do enough. He stood in the doorway of those dreams, and she woke with the ghost of hay in the sheets. Each morning she had a plan. Find where that night had ended, name the pieces that still had power over them both. Then she found the letter. Folded thin and stained, the envelope carried a handwriting slope she knew too well. Inside was a short note, ink blotched as if the writer had cried. "If you find him," it read, "be patient. He remembers more than you see. Ask him about the stream. Tell him the truth about the nights. He answers in his own way." M. The paper did not explain. It asked something dangerous. To speak a truth aloud. She had been avoiding names, keeping grief in a pocket so it wouldn't tear. Now the paper asked her to uncurl that fist. She went to the pond because the words told her to. The bank was honest and black. The line where the ice had given way still showed in the reeds. The gelding followed without hesitation, hooves making a ceremonial sound on the frozen path. She spoke first, because the place demanded a listener. "You shouldn't have been left," she said, because someone had to say it. When she told the pond story, the held thing broke. Men on ice, a rope that slipped, a hand that let go in a second that stretched long enough to drown. Saying it aloud was like uncorking a bottle she'd carried. The grief poured out uncivilized and animal. The gelding shifted and lowered himself beside her as if he handled sorrow the way horses handle storms, present and unruffled. She collapsed to the cold, and he lay next to her like a steady boat. His breath matched hers. Inhale, exhale. That rhythm was a harbor where the edges of her pain could settle without roaring. He placed his muzzle against her shoulder and stayed until her knees could carry her again. Neighbors began to show up in soft ways. A pot left by the gate, a teenager who mended a fence post without asking, someone who hung a lantern so the path was less lonely. At first she pushed the offers into the corner of her mind. They felt like intrusions. But one night a neighbor stayed to share the soup she hadn't known she needed. The gelding leaned into that stranger's hand with an ease that surprised them both, and the moment unlatched something patient and quietly. Small rules. Touch only when invited. Accept an apple slowly. Move with intention. One late winter afternoon, he led her to a hollow under the willow. He nosed at sod and pawed gently. Under a soft scrape she found a photograph, water softened but readable. A man with laugh lines and a horse with the scar on his cheek. The image was stubborn proof that the love had been real. She laughed and cried at once, the sound like breaking ice. Everything did not become whole. Loss is not a neat story. But the photograph made grief coherent, a thing to hold, to fold into a pocket. It turned sorrow into a beginning. By spring the gelding's coat deepened, and his steadiness loosened into earned calm. There were mornings when the stone in her chest felt unhooked, and afternoons when it resettled. The worst had thinned into a cautious hope. She could carry weight now with the knowledge someone else would carry some of it too. Months altered them slowly. People noticed she walked with less of the old crouched grief. The gelding moved with more curiosity than suspicion. He learned to wait properly at the mounting block, a small, civil lesson in patience, and she learned to accept help without feeling like charity. Then, one evening, he nudged her toward the tack room. Tucked behind a bridle, she found a carved wooden spoon, worn at the handle, the kind of object someone keeps to remember the shape of ordinary days. Its bowl had a child's clumsy heart and the initials M and R. She understood then that more than rescue had happened that night. There had been breakfasts and hands tying bridle straps with rough tenderness. She cried then, differently. Not the raw howl at the pond, but a steady, softer letting go. The spoon was not an answer so much as a map, permission to live with the history of love, not as a wound, but as foundation. Time did its slow work. He still had flinch and freeze, he always would. But he nickered when she came with the brush. He leaned into her and let her run her hand down the old scar. She slept better some nights. She planned small things, a trip to a far field, the tending of a foal she and a neighbor would foster. There was no miraculous fix. There was only the gradual mathematics of two beings learning to share weight. Sometimes the horse would look at her with an odd comprehension, as if to say, "I remember things you don't yet understand." Sometimes she would fold into his flank and feel less alone. On a quiet evening, she sat on a fence and watched him move across the field with a private pride. He tossed his head and turned back to check on her the way a friend checks the map on a hike. The river of their days had shifted. It still carried sorrow, but also the steady freight of ordinary kindness. If this quiet story touched something inside you, please subscribe, follow, leave a comment, and press the bell to watch daily videos and enjoy. Be here for the next true, human story, because sometimes the next one changes how you feel about everything.